about a specific moment after World War II. We'll be looking at some positions from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We'll be going from basically early 50s to early middle 70s across different countries in Europe. It is a lecture about a radical change, a radical shift in thinking in approaching architecture. It's a moment where architecture becomes less heroic somehow. Definitely, it's a moment of rejection from some architects, a definitive, acute rejection from some other architects, a critical rethinking of mainstream modernism. So, for instance, positions of architects such as orthodox functionalism, Bauhaus, early Le Corbusier are reconsidered and are, in some instances, highly criticized. There are some other projects or some other theories, especially referring to the lecture of last Wednesday, especially the one related to the late period of Le Corbusier, which are considered with much more fondness, a sense of empathy, and they become important reference for whatever shift is going to happen in those years. Now, I start always this lecture with these images. So one is a book which is not particularly relevant to you. You will probably not find this book. I don't think it has ever been translated into English, so don't waste your time. But this book was dear to me when I, years ago, was investigating about this time. And it's a book that was written by an Italian philosopher, Carlo Benedetti, who is comparing Pasolini and Calvino. Probably, I imagine some of you might be more familiar with Calvino because of Invisible Cities. It's something that everyone in architecture knows. Pasolini, I don't expect you to be familiar with him, but he was a great poet and movie director and intellectual. But the point of this book is that by comparing Pasolini and Calvino, Carlo Benedetti was making her argument was that both, also in very different way, Pasolini in a much more expressionist way, whereas Calvino in a much more rigorous, minimal way, which would be a fantastic lecture in itself, because he would be already a lecture about the different type of thinking in Italy, and somehow I will be talking about this next week, where, for instance, to be in Rome means to be someone, and to be in Milan means to be someone else. So the culture of the north and the culture of the south in Italy really are kind of different, but I shouldn't go there. The point that I'm making is that both Pasolini and Calvino, in their diversities, are now essential examples in the world of literature, more than architecture, of course, because Pasolini and Calvino are not art, but that's beside the point, are intellectuals who are changing the world in the 50s, the 60s, through the movies of Pasolini, through the poetry of Pasolini, but through the fantastic books and literature of Calvino. There is a sense of surreal, magic, intangible, even craziness, definitely less rationality. It's a time of passage from realism into neo-realism. And both Calvino and Pasolini are fantastic example, and not many others of neo-realism. The big image is an image of Archigram, great group active in those years. Today, some of them are still working. I think the cooker is still working, you know, and doing lots of things, but which is fantastic. But at the same time, Archigram were tracing a line with colleges like this, and I deliberately want to start this lecture with this image. Archigram didn't probably build that much. That was not at the point of these architects. Many things were not built at the time. There was lots of provocation through paper, through projects, but that's another good way of being an architect, I suppose. And Archigram, through images like this, already detaches themselves from that world that we described as a world that was putting forward an idea of metaphor between machine and architecture. This is definitely not an architecture as a machine anymore. This is an architecture that wants to have fun, that wants to deal with color, with pop art, with emerging aesthetic, which on the other end, with orthodox modernism was banned. The idea of aesthetic, the idea of style, you remember from last Wednesday, we discussed this a bit, was something that was not on at all. And so there are concepts that start to appear and pervade more or less in different way the different architecture that I'm going to show you, which are related to the idea of anthropological vernacular, being in touch again with a sense of history, and not just a canonical type of history, but also history as our own personal histories. We'll be talking at the end of the lecture about positions that are in touch with the hippie movement, with the Zen movement. Obviously we are talking today about an architecture that is revolving around the idea of existentialism. So let's start with the House of the Future, 1955-1956. Alison and Peter Smithsons, they are invited together with other architects and artists to propose an idea for an exhibition for the House of the Future. But it's very interesting here to see in this kind of pods, organic shapes that looks very much like almost primordial caves, you know, that we are dealing here, the Smithsons are dealing, yes, with an idea of the future, but the future is something that goes back to the past, to the primordial past. It's interesting that Rainer Banham, an English historian, very great, also very controversial, but obviously strongly engaged at the time with the architecture of the Smithsons, and Rainer Banham has always been an advocate of technology associated to architecture. He says about this project that although revolutionary in appearance, this house reinforces practices which already exist in embryo. Embryo, it's a word that I like to use, and I quoted this line simply because there is this very interesting relationship that Banham is proposing to us, to Banham works, and we should look at this space, at this architecture as something that relates to something that is embryonic, at an embryonic state. And for those who might not know, embryonic from the dictionary means unborn, rudimentary, unformed. And I like all this. I like that Rainer Banham is actually tracing this relationship between the future and something that is actually unformed. The architecture, you can see itself, it's pretty fun. The Smithsons like it to have fun, so there is this table that pops up. But what I really like of this house, I like everything pretty much from the Smithsons, but what I like particularly here is that this house is not only about the embryo, not only about the cave, not only about the primordial, even pre-medieval time, but it's about nature. you see that the house wants to have an internal garden, and the internal garden is all with grass, with trees. The trees are actually, also they obviously are trees, a bit pathetic because it's just an exhibition, but that's not the point. The point is that the Smithsons are actually dealing with this. The Smithsons are, for the first time, already in 1955, which is so many years ago, dealing with the idea of recovering, collecting the water. And so you can see, for instance, on the photo here, this very beautiful arm that comes down from the roof in order to collect the water. Okay, because that's already identified the future as something that will be in the need to deal with some environmental issues. And that was in 1955. And then the Smithsons were obviously very, how can I say, I always say this when I give my lecture on board. I tend to think that either people are gifted or not, and the Smithsons were. And so they come up with things like that, which other architects wouldn't even think about, because they are a little bit more released and more sophisticated in thinking about relationship between architecture, art, aesthetic. The Smithsons were very much into interdisciplinarity, which is something that in my opinion is very, very positive, and I would like to encourage you, because you are all from architecture, to be into interdisciplinary. To think that architecture is actually everything, except not just a building. And that's a lesson that the Smithsons were really fond to talk about and to always share with other people. But look at this door here, coming back to the embryonic. How really rudimentary or metaphoric of a cave passage. Or look at also the shape of the windows. Look at the mattress. These are very beautiful models there, acting as a couple that is relaxing. There is really lots of existentialism in this photo here, and what you see here is a mattress that is very simple, very unformed, very embryonic from the point of view. But embryonic is also this walking city, which is another vision by Archibald. 1964, as you can see here, proposing something, a vision, an idea of cities that start to move and to move even to water, to the land, to the world. We'll finish up today with some images of Super Studio and the continuous monument, where the formal resolution is very, very different. But the idea is always the same, the one of generating something that is around that is advocating possibility to move through the world. I also like, with this image, I also like to relate this image to probably the main positions of one of the most sophisticated philosophers of contemporary times, at least according to me, but it is highly recognized and highly celebrated to all the world. I'm talking here about Massimo Cacciari. Massimo Cacciari would be around, I guess, 60 to 70 years old, and he is a post-Heideggerian philosopher. He studied Heidegger, he studied Nietzsche, he is back to teaching philosophy, he published a lot. Very often he publishes in architecture magazines and for architecture groups. He was teaching for architecture until a few years ago. He became also the mayor of the town of Venice in Italy. He was the mayor of Venice for many years. He's originally from Venice. So it's a great philosopher because he's not just someone who is writing his paper and his theory. He does this, and they are also very sophisticated, but he's also engaged with the world. And Massimo Cacciari, one of the main points of his philosophy is that architecture is in between a state of movement and a state of stand. it's about architecture, and I will come back to this point in some other lecture, but it's about the state of being rooted into the land, which is what architecture is, but it's also about being nomadic in concepts, because architecture is always something, especially a certain type of architecture, we're talking about here, investigative research architecture, is something that is talking about projecting something for the future. The very same term to project comes from the ancient Latin, which is pro-iacere, which is to put forward. To project is to put forward. So to put forward means that architecture is actually putting forward, is actually going forward. So if you are interested in speculating about this, Massimo Cacciari and lots of his writing had been translated into English, is a fantastic reference, because you always, in a very Heideggerian way, you leave the questions open, but always arises the wonder, in a sense of wondering about this very impossible to solve, about this correspondence. Architecture being in between two poles that are apparently on the opposite sides, but in reality, maybe they are not so much opposite to each other. And this architecture somehow is already an architecture that is very static in its own, clunky form, and yet it is moving because it wants to be nomadic. I also have here from my own notes some references that you might like to look at, specifically related to this architecture. It is one is the chapter called Architecture and Existentialism, from a book which is called Differences by Ignacio de Solá-Morales. I repeat, Architecture and Existentialism, and the name of the book is Differences. And then two chapters from Modern Architecture, the book that Tafuri and Arco wrote in terms of history of architecture of the 20th century, the book that last Wednesday I suggested to you as the main book to have with you through a whole semester. Well, the third last and second last chapters in these books are focusing on the architecture of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And because we are going to talk also about Giancarlo de Carlo, obviously lots of books and articles and journals on the activity of this architect, who died in 2005. And obviously many other books about the radicals and about super studio and architecture. Ignacio de Solá-Morales, the author of that chapter I just mentioned, he invites the reader in the chapter to consider existentialism not as a strictly philosophical current, but as a cultural climate that brought with it a reordering of ethical and aesthetic viewpoints, and that consequently engendered profound changes in architecture in the year following World War II. So somehow he said in a much more articulate way what I have been raving about so far. And I talk about realism and neo-realism, the shift from realism into neo-realism. Well, again, dictionary, the dictionary that last Wednesday I was criticizing a bit for Nietzsche, but very often it's really very useful to our sense of rationality. And so I can quote to you from the Oxford Dictionary: neo-realism is the everyday, interpreted and filtered through our own subjective and personal interpretations, memories and experiences, whereas realism is an inclination to a general objectifications of reality in the name of truth based on actual facts. So embedded in the concepts of realism, there is much more sense of absolute truth for everyone, whereas in neo-realism, which is obviously a clear shift from realism, is much more an ambiguous type of truth, which is based much more on individual reinterpretations of the reality. That's pretty much also a message, one of the main messages of the philosophy of existentialism. And in these years also, we start to see photographies like done by Dorothea Lange on the left, or Walker Evans on the right, which are photographies that that takes photos of what until a few years earlier, it would have been considered like a dirty reality. Why would you take a photo of just an agricultural field? Of course, for us, maybe for you, this doesn't make sense because now we are part of the generation where we are capable of enjoying it. But for us, in the 50s, photos like this, they were really